probably the best story that we have about why this election came out as it did is what we were talking about earlier, that like people are really dissatisfied in the post-COVID economy with higher inflation and interest rates, and they took it out on the majority party. That's a kind of a dull answer, even if it's probably right, and it makes for bad punditry. And that like quite possibly the lesson for Democrats going forward is they shouldn't change anything, and then the next, the next election environment will probably be more favorable to them, particularly when there's pushback against whatever the Trump administration is going to do, which there will be. I'm pretty confident of that, but that's in some ways maybe too simple an answer. Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. So, we are recording this on Tuesday, November 19th, exactly 2 weeks after the 2024 presidential election. The outcome of that election was not exactly a surprise. Trump's victory was well within the ranges predicted by polls, but it was nonetheless a fairly jarring outcome. We're already seeing some of the consequences of it in Trump's early cabinet picks. But today we're going to dig into, what exactly we saw in the election results, what we learned about campaign effects, about polling, about the election narratives that come out of it. And we'll also hopefully have time to get into ice cream. But I want to start off, John, by asking you a question about the campaigns. So in some sense, this election was a pretty good chunk of evidence that campaigns don't do a whole hell of a lot. In the sense that there was a huge mismatch here. By my reckoning, Kamala Harris ran a really good campaign. She managed to raise $1 billion in a short period of time. She gave an absolutely devastating debate performance against Donald Trump. She had a really sophisticated and well-resourced ground game and advertisement campaign. She was endorsed by several hundred prominent Republicans, whereas her opponent was endorsed by no one from the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, Trump had, as far as I could tell, a not really good campaign. Not the worst I've ever seen, but it was very disorganized. They constantly had to apologize for their speakers. Trump was constantly veering into some fairly racist content. It was, very haphazard, and it was not nearly as well financed. And of course, he wins. And so, I'm just sort of wondering, and also in thinking of those endorsements, 95% of Republicans vote for Trump, 95% of Democrats vote for Harris. It's hard to see much evidence that this campaign did anything. So I've just, let me throw that to you and ask, what did you see?
Look, I think there's the old Joe Biden line of don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And I think understanding if there's campaign effects here, you have to figure out what the non-campaign baseline would have been, right? And I think there's two ways you can look at it. The first is some stats have gone around that in the kind of industrialized world, the developed world, however however you want to define that, 2024 was the first election year in history that every single incumbent party in the industrialized world lost. It has never been a unanimous decision, either all the incumbents winning or all the incumbents losing, until this year. Globally, folks are fed up. They're furious. They're punishing governments on the left. They're punishing governments on the right. We talked about this in one of our early episodes that, this is everyone around the world is fed up and is angry with inflation, but also with, social media and we know so much now, and we're all hooked into these information superhighways. There are a lot of people whose job it is to make us mad because that is, helps their bottom line. They do it really well. So, you can start it, and Harris did better than almost all of the other sort of incumbent party politicians in the rest of the world. So you can measure it that way. But I think the clearer way that you can see that campaigns really did make a difference here is that the average difference between Harris and Biden in the non-battleground states, in the 43 states plus DC that the campaigns didn't care about, Harris did 6 points worse on average, 5 or 6 points worse than Biden. One of the challenges here is that a lot of this data gets developed and a lot of the narratives get set in the day or two after the election, whereas they're still counting votes in California. They will be for another week. So these numbers are all a bit of a moving target until December. But overall, 5 or 6 points, Harris did worse than Biden in the non-battleground states. And in the battleground states, she did 1 to 3 points worse. Wisconsin, she only did 1% worse. Arizona of the battleground moved the furthest. But for the most part, her numbers held up really well relatively in the states that she was advertising, that she was making speeches in, where they had people knocking on doors. I think if you'd asked me before the election what the difference a good campaign could make, I would say it's probably about 3 points. And that difference is about 3 points
Mhm.
where they invested, where both campaigns invested. I think the bigger question mark around the campaign effectiveness comes in the national campaign, right? I think there's no question that Harris's ads were great, and that the super PAC ads supporting Harris were great. They were well tested. They were smart. They were effective. The field campaigns were good. They knew which voters to talk to. They went out and talked to them. Um, I think there are real questions about how much the campaign could have done to shape the national conversation. I think Harris is a naturally cautious politician. I think Democrats right now are a cautious party. I think you saw the team that worked for Biden and then mostly transitioned to working for Harris had an approach to campaigning that was sort of do no harm first, where
Mhm.
they were pretty safe. What Harris did for the 100 days that she was the nominee is that she flew around, she made speeches in front of Democratic audiences in front of a nice background. And the speeches were mostly the same. That was her move. And they did it well, but it wasn't a real risk-taking campaign from a national point of view, right? She wasn't really
Mhm.
proposing breakthrough policies. She wasn't going into unusual forums. They played it pretty safe. I think it's easy to now sort of Monday morning quarterback this and say, oh,
Right.
they should have gone on Joe Rogan. They should have, done more stunts. They should have done more things to change the conversation. They should have, put her in front of different kinds of audiences at different times. That's easy to say in hindsight. I don't know how much of a difference that would have made. I do hope that, as Democrats figure out a path forward, that we take some of those lessons really to heart, that, we we can't talk to ourselves all the time. We can't stay inside bubbles. We need candidates that are comfortable being risky. We need candidates who are really comfortable speaking extemporaneously and off the cuff. And that might mean that they make some mistakes, but it also means that they'll seem like real live human beings.
Mhm. That's okay, that's really interesting. Okay, I wanted to ask you, I was talking with actually previous guest on our podcast, Joe Fold, a
Hmm.
political consultant in DC, who had suggested that one thing that was really important and has not gotten a lot of attention is that the Democrats were kind of silent for a big chunk of this summer, in the sense that, like, from the moment of Joe Biden not doing well in the June debate with Donald Trump, and for like a good 7 weeks after that, the campaign was not doing things that the campaign would normally doing. That is, they were not reaching out to voters. They were not honing a message. They were essentially talking to themselves about, is Biden up for this task and how do we get him to leave if he isn't?
Right.
And I'm wondering, that strikes me as earlier than we should really be worrying about this stuff. That I'm not sure how much voters really care about what happens then, but I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah,
That
it's an
may
interesting
have hurt
theory.
the Democrats.
I think that I don't know that that holds up with the data as I saw it coming in.
Hmm.
The switch from Biden to Harris was the high point for the Democratic campaign, right? That people were excited, there
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
energy, there's enthusiasm. A lot of voters who had given up on Harris and had moved from Biden to undecided came back in a flash. I think that those 7 weeks then followed a period that was really good for the campaign, and I think the sort of Harris becoming or Biden dropping out through the Democratic convention was the high point of the race. And it's when, people were interested and excited. And I think after that, the campaign sort of locked her down and it really locked Tim Walz down. And I think that the reasons that Tim Walz was chosen was his skill at going on Fox News, and challenging the
Hmm.
Republicans and doing those sorts of things that he stopped doing. Um, and I think that, you know, there wasn't necessarily a build from that point. And there's a lot of reasons why. And again, the folks working on that campaign had access to much more data than you and I had access to much more data than anybody listening to this. Like, it I don't mean to sound uncharitable by saying, oh, I would X, Y, and Z is clear now, because it is clear now. And I don't know that it was clear back then. And obviously we don't have the counterfactual where the campaign was taking more risks and those risks didn't pay off. So
Mm. Okay.
yeah, I think that,
Um,
overall,
yeah.
my takeaway from this is not that campaigns didn't work. It's that, if you'll forgive the sports analogy, campaigns are a goal line unit, right? Like, if you are at the 1 or 2 yard line, a good campaign is going to make a difference. If you prefer a soccer analogy, a campaign is like a penalty kick if the game is tied after 90 minutes, right? Or however many minutes they play soccer. I'm not really clear on that. Um, it's not something that's going to make a difference all the time or even most of the time. It's going to make a difference if it's tied. And I think what's really clear is this election wasn't tied. That the national
Right.
environment had moved. I think we can get into this in the polling conversation, but for the first time in my living memory, more people went to the polls saying that they were Republicans than Democrats. And, some of that's a
Yeah.
turnout thing, but a lot more of it's a persuasion thing. And, I think voters were sick and tired of Democratic leadership. I think Joe Biden had only been president for 4 years, but Democrats have been in charge of some part of the government for a long time. And, even though Donald Trump was president in 2020, most voters think that those decisions made around the pandemic were made by Democrats. I think there's just a lot of frustration and annoyance, and we have a very angry electorate. Um, and now Republicans are going to control all of it, and they are going to be the focus of that angry electorate. And there's uh, I'm worried about what's going to happen. I'm worried about protecting a lot of the people that we care about. I'm worried about you know fluoride in our water and you know
Hmm.
immigrant families being torn apart. But from a pure tactical point of view, there is some advantage to having lost everything and letting 100% of the government be in the hands of the Republicans and letting voters see if they like what they've chosen. Right? That I think a lot of people were voting emotionally. They were voting because they were angry. I don't think they thought of themselves as voting for Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, but that's what they're going to get because the idea that the Republican Senate will stand up to that is fanciful, um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and we'll see what the voters of this country think about what they have chosen.
Yes. And I think, I mean, what you're saying about, what happened to the Democrats was happening to majority parties all over the world. I think is completely right. And it also reminds us that like Kamala Harris was brought in on a rescue mission, right? She was, that Joe Biden looked heading toward a pretty significant loss. Things immediately looked a lot better once she was at the helm, but she was still brought in a very difficult situation to save a party that looked like it was the source of a lot of voter anger. And there's only so much a candidate can do about that.
Well, and the reason that she got the nomination easily is because she was Joe Biden's number two, but that also put her in a really tough spot because she couldn't credibly break with the Biden administration in a way that, if it was Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom or someone else who is, outside of the Biden could have maybe come in and said, these guys made mistakes and I'm mad about it too. She just couldn't do that credibly. I'm sure that the campaign tested that and tried to see if there was a way of doing it. And, it just didn't work. But
And
everybody liked to
there's
talk about how Democrats' problems
yeah.
were, Joe Biden was old and the rest of it. But I think when Canada has its election in a few months, you're going to see a much younger candidate get thrown out in a much larger vote than we just saw here. Um, you know, this is voter anger around the world, which is some ways is due to inflation. But I think a piece that has not nearly been given enough credit is that we are in a new environment here where a lot of the media that we're consuming is not designed to make us smarter. It's designed to make us mad. And we are seeing that everywhere, right? The Murdochs have a news outlet in every English speaking country except for New Zealand. and New Zealand is always the one English-speaking country that is different. We exist in a social media and a news environment where people are trying to make folks angry. They do because that keeps you tuned in, that keeps you clicking, and I don't think we can understate how effective that's been, and how much it warps the electorate and how much it warps the way that we think about the world.
Yeah. Um, just make a quick point that another one of our previous guests had said, Julia Zari had made a point on another podcast that, if a party really does want to pick a nominee who has very little to do with their current president, they really want to distance themselves from an unpopular administration. Well, the Republicans tried that in 2008 with John McCain, that's probably about the smartest pick you can come up with if people were angry with George W. Bush. McCain's very much outsider in the party, and like they don't have not a lot of love lost between the two of them, and they still lose by 8 points. Like it's something that's very hard to overcome when people are angry at your party.
I think you got to go
But
remember
yeah,
that 2008 happened in a few months after the financial crisis, right? Like, I don't know that financial crisis.
or in the
I think
middle of, but yeah,
Yeah, Dennis Kucinich could
yeah,
have been elected if he were the Democratic nominee in 2008, right? Like, I
yeah.
think,
Oh hell yeah.
I I think if you ran that election with a different Republican candidate, he would have done even worse than McCain. But one of the challenges about doing um, political science is that we only get to do each of these elections once, and it's hard to
This
have
is
a
true. Yeah.
counterfactual.
Let I want to ask you about polling, but my impression was that and I've been surprised how many people have complained to me to say, "Oh, well, the polls missed it again." I feel like they actually did pretty well this year, particularly in the swing states. I was curious, basically, what you thought about polling overall, and also like some of the experimental methods that
Yeah,
some pollsters use, like voting on previous weight recall or voting on recall of previous elections, and waiting on that, like how those methods did this year, and what we see going forward.
yeah. No, I think polling did pretty good. I In 2022, the polls are pretty accurate, but the vibe said that it was going to be a Republican landslide. And so when it wasn't a Republican
Right.
landslide, people were like, oh, the polls were off. The polls weren't off. The vibes were off. And I think we saw that again in 2024, where the polls said, we don't know what's going to happen. This is uncertain. There's a lot of potential here. But the vibe said, well, surely Kamala Harris is going to win. And, when the election result, the polls were pretty accurate, but the vibes once again were completely skewed. Um, yeah, I think that the swing state polling was pretty good. It may have understated Trump a little bit. This is another place though where the challenge of how slow we count our votes is hard. In the immediate aftermath of the election, it looked like there was maybe going to be a 4 or 5 point Trump national victory. It's now going to be probably just about a point. He's under 50% of the national vote and dropping. Once California counts its ballots, he's going to have won by a smaller a smaller popular vote than Hillary Clinton won. So
Right.
part of the challenge here is that folks get these narratives set, and I want to come back to narratives because I think I know you've done a lot of thinking on that. But folks get these narratives set when they just don't have enough information in, right? And when the votes are not all counted. Um, Overall, I think that this election was a win for the team weighted vote to previous vote recall folks, which is not a team that
Hmm.
I counted myself on before election day, but I think they very clearly had it right. That the polls that were weighted to vote recall were better for the most part. I think that some of the folks who don't wait to voted recall, like the New York Times, but who have pretty aggressive partisan weighting, uh, did okay. I think that there's trouble there is, as I mentioned earlier, parties shifted quite a bit, and this was the most Republican electorate that we've seen in my lifetime for sure. So if you were waiting to a party recall, you had to let that float enough to make sure that or if you're waiting to not to partisanship, not to recall, you had to make sure that you were getting the modeling right on how much the party should be. I think that folks who waited to 2020 vote uh, were more accurate, even if a lot of the people who said that they had voted for Trump and thought of themselves as independents before now thought of themselves as Republicans. I think overall that it was a little bit better. The big losers in this election were the folks who came with the very low weighting methods. Ann Seltzer, most prominent of all, who had been incredibly accurate in the past, following methods that a lot of the rest of the field had dropped. Just kind of doing random digit dialing and having very minimal weights. Um, she was way off in Iowa. I think that that sort of the nail in the coffin for a minimalist weighting approach, which is a shame because
Mhm.
what an incredible record. She announced a couple days ago she was retiring from election polling, and it's a shame to have her go out on this note.
Yeah, no, she's done incredibly well off a very simple model and just been like a real purist with that and predicted a lot of elections extremely well, even ones that weren't expected to come out certain ways. And this is a bad way for her to go out. And I do have a great deal of sympathy there. Yeah.
I think that she ran out of road, and Iowa
Yeah.
is a relatively homogenous, easy, state that likes talking to strangers. Was a place
Mhm.
that it could survive this long, but if it doesn't work in Iowa, it's not going to really work anywhere. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, Seth. I know a lot of your work focuses on sort of the parties writ large and structures. What do what the folks you're talking to, the reading that you're doing? How do you think the Democrats in particular are trying to explain what happened?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really interested in this whole the narratives that get constructed. Well, people the stories people tell themselves about why this election came out a certain way and what they can be doing differently in the future. And it is interesting. I've actually done a little bit of uh mostly I've just been following conversations, but also been like, doing a little bit of survey collection on this just to see what people are thinking. And in some of the we're seeing sort of the same sorts of narratives that emerge, anytime Democrats lose. I mean, one of them is, it has to do with racism and sexism. Some of them are saying that like this was about who she was as a candidate. This is the fact that she's a woman of color and this country won't vote for a woman of color. Um, I honestly think I don't think that's supported by the data. I think and in some ways I think it's a dangerous assumption to make. I think a lot of people are very quick to conclude that the country will never vote for a woman for president when in fact they would. She was brought in a very difficult political environment. Women candidates run about as well as men do in state races for governor and senate. And also, like, this vote was very consistent with a lot of economic forecast models that have nothing to do with race or gender. Just suggesting that it was a tough year for the Democrats, regardless. But okay, but that is one that has come up, and I know this will be a conversation over the next 4 years as Democrats think about who they want to nominate and whether they think that a woman of color can win. There's also the usual like, oh, Democrats were too woke. Someone used the term Latinx somewhere, and or maybe that they just overall had bad messaging. They didn't focus on the economy enough. They didn't, reassure people about inflation, or that Harris didn't do enough to distance herself from the unpopular Biden administration, which was always going to be a hard sell for her. Um, but just sort of like basic things like that. Um, I I tend to think that probably the best story that we have about why this election came out as it did is what we were talking about earlier, that like people are really dissatisfied in the post-COVID economy with higher inflation and interest rates, and they took it out on the majority party. That's a kind of a dull answer, even if it's probably right, and it makes for bad punditry. And that like quite possibly the lesson for Democrats going forward is they shouldn't change anything, and then the next, the next election environment will probably be more favorable to them, particularly when there's pushback against whatever the Trump administration is going to do, which there will be. I'm pretty confident of that,
Yes.
um, but that's in some ways maybe too simple an answer,
Yeah.
and I don't know exactly how to think about that.
What about, again, one of the hard parts of all of this is that when folks want answers to this and when they want to set these narratives, we just don't have very good data. That exit poll data is really flawed. It's going to get reweighted. The AP Vodcast is flawed. It's going to get reweighted. Like, we will get a really good sense of sort of how ethnic and demographic and different groups voted, but it's going to be in March, right? It's going to be after these things have all been set. But I do think it's difficult with the data that we're seeing. And you look at the counties along the Rio Grande, you look at Miami-Dade
Mhm.
County, it's very clear that Hispanic voters moved toward Republicans. And I think we'll need to get a
Yes.
lot more nuance on that. But it's also clear that, Manhattan moved toward Trump, and Vail, Colorado moved toward Trump, and lots of sort of upper elite white educated places, but also a lot of Hispanic places, but also Muslim American places, but also X, Y, and Z, right? And I think the only theory that makes sense to me for why both Manhattan and the Rio Grande Valley and the precinct in Chicago where the prisoners are held all move dramatically toward Trump, is that people are unhappy. I think it's harder to point toward racism and sexism necessarily in those contexts. The AP vote cast data, which I don't put a ton of stock in, actually suggests that Black women were more likely to vote for Trump in 2024 than 2020. Now, it's a matter of 3% in 2020 and 7% in 2024. So, certainly the reason Trump won is because of white people. But the margins moved in a way that I think is important to understand for Democrats. But yeah, it's hard to get a clear story at this point. I think by the time we will, I wonder what's going to be set. I think it'll be very interesting. Does the party look to Harris as its leader going forward, or do people say, "Oh, well, we gotta put the entire Biden era behind us and go a completely different direction?" I think we'll start to see in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's going to be interesting about the 2028 Democratic contest is that it's pretty open. It's, unlike the last several, there's not going to be an obvious person going in who, like, seen as sort of the anointed one.
Yeah, which
And there's a lot of much younger players who, could be very interesting.
as a Democrat, I'm really excited for that. That we have, you can make an argument that since 2008, when Obama upset Clinton, um, we have had a boring, predictable nomination process where the candidate everybody thought was going to be the candidate was, and for the most part, it has not been great for us. And I think the Democratic Party needs to figure out who we want to be. We need to figure out, what direction we want to go in. Um, yeah, I do. Just you'd earlier talked about the sort of, you know, is this too woke? Is the messaging bad? Is that part of the story? And I think, and it's again the distinction between how the battleground states did and the non-battleground states, I think sheds a lot of light on this. That in the
Hmm.
battleground states, we were talking about the economy, we were talking about education, we were talking about healthcare, we were talking about Social Security, and that was on TV, and it was in these events. I think the way that the campaign was experienced in New York and California and Texas and Florida had more to do with, you know, Kamala Harris's position on transgender inmates and whether somebody said Latinx once upon a time. And it's worth
Hmm.
noticing that when the conversation is less disciplined, Democrats did a lot worse. And I think that, you know,
Mm.
as a Democrat, I hope one lesson that we take from this is that the way that we talk to voters in Pennsylvania should be the way that we talk to voters everywhere. And that's going to
Hmm.
require a lot more messaging discipline. That's going to require a lot more people, maybe biting their tongue or, not giving the stem winder of a speech that's going to make their low dollar donations flow in, but be more focused on, you know, what we know works for us, right? That we have a set of messages that are very successful, have been successful for a long time. And, reporters are bored by them, donors are bored by them, operatives are bored by them. So we talk about other things when we don't think it matters, but it did matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? We have just a little bit of time. So, would you like to talk about ice cream?
That's it. Ice cream is so much better than politics.
Yes.
You and I mostly talk about flour based things, which makes sense given the title. But I think both of us have been on an ice cream making kick lately. And when you're sad, you want ice cream. Also, as we come to the end of the Joe Biden era of American politics, it feels appropriate to talk
Yes.
about ice cream. You
Yes.
just you
It's
just
truly
made
his
some,
favorite
right?
food. Yes, I made a kind of an old standby recipe of coffee toffee Heath bar crunch.
Oh, I like all
That
those words.
um, it's actually pretty simple. I've been using this kind of base recipe I got from a cookbook a number of years ago that really works remarkably well. And the basis of it is like 3 egg yolks, not the whites, mixed with 3/4 a cup of sugar. You got a little bit of salt and a little bit of flour in there, and then I think it's a cup of milk and a cup and a half of cream. And I usually either I add like a little bit of very strong decaf coffee, or you can also mix in like an instant espresso or something like
Mhm.
that. Either way does pretty good on the coffee flavor. Um, but I find like that base does a really nice job of just, you chill it, then and it doesn't get, one of the worst sins is when people, kind of back off. They realize just how much cream goes into ice cream, and they like, well, I should use low fat milk or something. No, you should not, because it gets kind of frosty. You get like that, a little bit of ice crystals in there, and you don't want that. You want it to be nice and creamy. And if you want to not have the bad effects on your body, eat less of it. But that's
And then
but
what's
that's
your
what I would say to
equipment?
that.
What's your equipment set up for churning?
So I have what I'm pretty sure is a Cuisinart. And it's a very simple device. It is the bowl itself is something you stick in the freezer for a day and then pull it out, and then the device just rotates the bowl. That's, you can get one of those pretty cheap these days, well under $100. You can get fancier machines that actually have their own cooling device.
Right.
Those run in the range of several hundreds to more. The nice things about those is, like, if you're making a lot of ice cream, you need to be able to do that and keep being able to chill it. Whereas, like, it takes a while to actually chill the freezing element.
Yeah.
But
I have
I
just the
found this
KitchenAid
bowl does a
attachment.
good job for me. Yeah, yeah.
I have the
Oh,
KitchenAid
okay.
attachment for mine, which you have to keep I keep the bowl in my chest freezer, and it's just always there. But it takes up a
Okay.
lot of space, which not everybody's got.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that is
started
true.
when
That is
I
true.
wanted to learn how to make ice cream. I just used the New York Times basic recipe, which is really good, but it's 6 egg
Okay.
yolks, which means that
Oh,
6 egg
that's
yolks,
full
which is
on.
it's
That's
wild.
Philadelphia custard right there. That's
Yeah, but then I have 6 egg whites, which means that I have to make meringue, which then usually is like 8 egg whites, and then I need to make more ice cream, and it ends up being crazy. But
yeah,
recently I
that's a
made a
lot.
lot of apple butter for a project I was doing, and then I thought that it would be really good in ice cream, and it was. So I there was
Oh,
what
good
that was
call.
my
Good
November
call.
recipe development project in the pre-election warm up. Is I made ice cream base and I mixed about a cup of apple butter in, because it's hard to make an apple ice cream. It's such a subtle flavor, but the concentrated apple
Mm,
butter with the spices was amazing. And then I made
good
oatmeal
call.
cookies and I crumbled them into the mix. And yeah, it was good.
Very good call.
We have a new fall tradition in my house.
Ooh, I may try that. So one tip I have on this is when you're adding something in, like I put in like a bunch of Heat Bar chips, um, those should be frozen. You want those at,
Mm.
at the cold temperature that the ice cream is going to be at. So, when you hack them up, you stick them in the freezer and then take them out when you need them. Because otherwise you can end up heating up the ice cream just when it's getting cold, and that can actually make it a little frostier, and it ruins uh, the consistency. So,
That's a good tip.
uh, and I don't know how well that would work for apple butter, because if you freeze that, it won't pour. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I
yeah,
mixed it into
something to
the
think on.
custard before I churned it. But I should have frozen my
Smart.
oatmeal
Okay,
cookie chunks.
I would recommend
Yeah.
that. Okay,
Yeah. Awesome. Well, it
this
was
has
great
been
catching up with
helpful.
you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're probably gonna take a couple week break over the holidays. But we are gonna be back. There's gonna be a lot of American politics to try to explain. And I'm excited to be part of doing that with you.
Yes, I am excited about it too, folks. There will be a lot of power and flour in 2025 to discuss. We've got a whole new administration to take apart, and we've got a lot of campaigns coming up. So
Yeah.
there's plenty to think about.
And a Democratic Party is gonna figure out what we want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all for sticking with us in 2024. John, thanks for working with me on this. This has been great. And I will talk to you in the new year.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.